this was a sort of a pre-inventory, you know. And in the end, through the survey form, we have the clear identification of the elements which appear in every building and which has to be preserved, or which have to be mitigated, or which may be also demolished or renovated. During this time of preparation of the survey, we also began to train, you know, the surveyors to the data entry and to the preparation of thematic maps and to the use of the GIS, doing some limited surveys in the areas surrounding our office, and it was very important for them to see the kind of thematic maps that could be produced through their survey, because they understood, you know, the use of the GIS, one of the uses of the GIS. Well, the GIS was completed in 2 years, the GIS of the old city of Sana'a. It included, I don't remember exactly, somewhere, well, in the book you can find the figures. In the end, there were about 15,000 records of building and public spaces and special construction and so on. The GIS was used the thematic maps of the GIS were used to do an exhibition. The people was very happy. GOPSI started to use the GIS to monitor the building activity, a few months. But at the same time, you know, the municipality refused to give GOPSI the data concerning the building permission that they were issuing. And so since the beginning, the GIS was incomplete because it was supposed to be updated continuously with the data coming from the building permits. Then never happened, and this never happened. So since in a few months, the information platform was becoming older and older because there was the lack of update, you know, with the data which should have been given by the municipality. This is another issue. A GIS like this needs to be shared amongst different administrations, because especially if the information that are made, the information that can be found in the GIS depends on different administration, it's evident that each administration has to contribute, you know, to the updating of the information platform. This happened only in the very, very few first days, then the major change, and never didn't happen anymore. And this was already the first step towards the death of the GIS. Let me open a bracket, which is important. You know, at least in Italy, the first use of GIS in urban planning, let's say, in Italy, date of the early 90s. There were small municipalities which started the GIS, and now it's used almost everywhere as a normal tool for urban management and so on. But in the very beginning, I remember very well the case of medium-sized city, Carpi that was the first city in Italy to set up a GIS. And it looks absolutely useless, you know, and it looks like, I mean, there was an architect, a crazy architect, who wanted to do the GIS for his own purposes or whatever. Crazy architect in the municipality. This crazy architect managed to convince the mayor to do the GIS and to because it shows that the GIS could be used very well to impose the taxes, you know, concerning the car right-of-way to the buildings. And in Italy you have to pay the right-of-way, you know, and if you have a house and you have a garage or a parking within your block, you have to pay the right, you know, the right-of-way to enter your garage and so on. It's a small tax. Small, but you have a lot of right-of-way, you know, and so this architect showed the way. Well, you see, in this way, we can link my GIS with the data of the fiscal office, you know, and you know who has to pay the right-of-way, who has paid, who has not paid, who is paying, who is not paying, and so on. And this was the main reason of success, you know. He showed that with the GIS you could manage to control the right-of-ways. In other cases it was more or less the same, the waste disposal, the waste collection, you know. This is another tax you pay in the municipalities. The first reason of the success of the GIS was that it was an efficient tool for the municipalities to get the taxes, you know, to control the local taxes. Anyway, this has not very much to do with what I was trying to say, but this is something that it is important to take into your mind, because the GIS is most of all a system which enables to put together data which are coming from different sources. So, even if your GIS is intended to produce data to apply and to monitor the application of a building regulation, indeed it can be structured and it must be structured in such a way that other data can be added, and in such a way that the same GIS can be shared by different administrations for different purposes. So it becomes a kind of container of data which also may be very, very different. But however, if we are talking of building, if we are talking of the inventory for the building inventory for urban planning purposes, it is very important that you can put whatever you want in the pot, you know. But what is important that the essential things are there. That you really understand what are the crucial data you need to control and to check the most relevant processes in the historic city. You can add whatever you want, but be careful not to forget the essential. And the essential very often is what I was talking about before. I mean, it's all the informations which are required, which are related to the impact of a building on the surrounding context. So whenever you whenever you plan your survey, you have always to ask yourself, what is the impact of this building on the context? What is the contribution of this building to the surrounding area? What would be the impact of possible modification of this building on the surroundings? This is absolutely essential. So, anyway, an exhibition was made, and for the first time, the people showed, the extent of some processes, that we were talking about, and that were absolutely clear to a lot of responsible, for instance. This is a map of, for instance, the architectural quality, the architectural merit. It's a map which represented the general evaluation that we did for all the buildings, and it shows that, the quality of the building may vary very much in the old city, and that even if the old city looks very homogeneous, is indeed very, very diversified. And the homogeneity is due to the fact, like, as I said yesterday when I talked about the Grand Canal, is due to the fact that indeed you have an urban fabric which is still strongly characterized by by some rules, you know, of growth, by some rules of organization of the buildings and the relationship between the buildings and the open spaces. One map which was quite interesting is this one, for instance. Here you can see we were aware of this process of transformation of the buildings from the house of a family to a multi-apartment or to a multi-family house. We were thinking that the process was mostly linked to the so-called Sukization of some axes. Indeed, we realized that one of the questions in our questionnaire, in our survey form, was if the building was inhabited by one or more family. Always remember that our resources were very limited. The presumed time was 6 months. Then it happened to become 2 months, but in the very beginning it was 6 months. And that the survey was mostly made from outside, without entering within the building. So we didn't have any possibility to count the number of households. But we were able to see if the house was inhabited by one or more households. And so, you see, we immediately realized that the number of buildings which are inhabited by more families is very high. It's about 30%. And is not only concentrated in the souk area, or in the new souk areas, but it begins to be quite widespread, for instance. Then one of the issues we have tried to understand through our surveys was the extent of the interventions that were made on a building in the last 15 years. Why 15 years? 15 years can be, there could have been 18 years or whatever. 15 years because the famous map of the Koreans was 15 years old. And so, with comparison to that map, we could immediately understand, for instance, if a building was built recently or not. If it was built before or after, you know, 1952. So, also, 15 years was just a term, time span just to say recently, let's say. And so, here there was the attempt to understand also what kind of transformations occurred in the building, according to a series of definitions of interventions, which were then used to define the categories of interventions. So you can see, for instance, that a lot of new buildings have appeared in the last 15 years, but also some demolitions, equally some demolitions appears, or some interventions of redevelopment and reconstruction from new. Well, this is a thematic map, is rather conventional. I mean, the general building conditions, that is the conditions of the structural conditions, and also based on a different crossing, you know, of these informations, we have defined the types, the categories of interventions to be suggested through the temporary norms, which were only partially approved by the government. The same kind of work, but simplified, was made for the public services, for the public spaces and the open space and the Mekshmat or Bustans, which may be not public, let's say the agricultural land, within the city. All this was summarized in some temporary, in a sort of temporary zoning with temporary, very simplified regulations that basically prevented demolitions of the buildings which have a certain heritage interest, which according to the survey had some heritage interest. There was regulations which made possible the sur-elevation of a building, the vertical addition of a building with certain rules, which we decided not to give a maximum height to the building, because this would have had as an outcome the homogeneous building height all over the city, and we want to keep, so we started a system of possible incremental vertical addition, depending on the existing height of the building and depending also on the size of the building itself. Well, there were some regulations also aimed at controlling the land use, in particular to stop the spread of commercial activities in the residential areas, and so on. Very few measures that were intended not to provide a plan of conservation, because a plan of conservation requires also a more complex and a more general overall vision of the future of the city. So, as I tried to explain before, a plan of conservation requires the identification of policies to be implemented. This was just a plan, not a plan. These were measures of protection in order to avoid that the urban fabric would deteriorate further, and would lose in the time, its character and the values that justify the inscription in the World Heritage List. Beside that, we proposed a work plan for the preparation of the conservation plan. This plan, since 5 years, has never been indeed implemented, even if every 6, 8, 1 month, 1 year, I receive a very kind invitation by a minister or by a director